that the Vice President and the Secretary of State released last week regarding our determination that Russia's forces and other officials committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Beth will have some opening remarks, and then she will take your questions. So without further ado, Ambassador von Skak.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As you've heard, Vice President Kamala Harris announced at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of State Antony Blinken's determination that Russia's forces and other Russian officials have committed crimes against humanity. This determination follows extensive analysis by the department, including by my office, which is the Office of Global Criminal Justice, of information indicating that members of Russia's forces committed execution-style killings of Ukrainian men, women, and children, tortured civilians in detention, including through beatings, electrocutions, and mock executions, raped women and girls, and alongside other Russian officials, deported hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians, including children. As Secretary Blinken explained in his statement, quote, "These acts are not random or spontaneous. They're part of the Kremlin's widespread and systematic attack against Ukraine's civilian population." When it comes to the abduction and deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children, President Joe Biden announced this weekend in remarks in Poland that Russia has stolen Ukrainian children in an attempt to steal Ukraine's future. Now, just by way of background, crimes against humanity are a constellation of acts that are made criminal under international law when they're committed as part of a widespread or a systematic attack against a civilian population with knowledge of that attack. The key element is this widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. And this is what generally distinguishes crimes against humanity from other international crimes. In the case of Ukraine, the Secretary determined that the attack against Ukrainian civilian population was both widespread and systematic. And he also noted that we reserve crimes against humanity determinations for the most egregious crimes. Although crimes against humanity are as old as humanity, the legal concept traces its origin to the World War II period and the charter of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Some of the crimes that were committed by the Nazis, such as the mass deportation of civilians or the mass imprisonment and forced labor of civilians, were committed against allies or its own citizens in the war. These could not be prosecuted as ordinary war crimes as the way in which war crimes were formulated at the time. And the Genocide Convention was not created until 1948. So to capture the full scope of the horrors suffered by civilians, the concept of crimes against humanity was included within the Nuremberg Charter. Senior Nazi military and other government officials were prosecuted for this crime, including those who helped to forcibly deport thousands of civilians. Now, this weekend's determination that members of Russia's forces and other Russian officials committed crimes against humanity is part of the United States' multifaceted policy to hold Russia to account for atrocities being committed in Ukraine. As President Biden said yesterday, no one should turn away their eyes from the atrocities Russia is committing against the Ukrainian people. The United States, together with the international community, is committed to holding those responsible, both the direct perpetrators and the architects of violence, to account, no matter how long this might take. This includes supporting existing pathways to accountability in Ukrainian courts, in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice, and in courts around the world once they establish jurisdiction over individuals accused of committing international crimes in Ukraine. This is a new Nuremberg moment, and the world must remain united in support of justice. So with that, I'm very pleased to take any questions.
Hi, thanks for doing this. So I think, I have to go back and look, but I think you explained my first question, which was the difference between this designation announced over the weekend and the prior one that
Yes.
the Secretary made about war crimes. So I think I get that distinction now. But my second question is, does this new determination change the approach that the administration has had and does have and will have going forward in terms of collection of evidence and supporting prosecutions?
Yeah, thank you. Just to maybe elaborate on your first question, indeed, one of the distinctions is this widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. War crimes can only be committed in an armed conflict situation. Many of the types of conduct do overlap, and so you could cumulatively charge if you were a prosecutor. But there are some war crimes that can be committed against combatants. So, for example, prisoners of war in custody, and we've seen that in Ukraine, that Ukrainian prisoners of war had been mistreated, and there have been efforts to cover up that mistreatment by Russia's forces. Here we have a widespread and systematic attack that's been directed against the civilian population. So that's the key distinction between those two crimes. For your second question, it really doesn't change much about our approach. The Biden-Harris administration has been fully committed to hold Russia to account for its brutal war in Ukraine, and it has been doing that since the beginning, since a year ago, almost this week. And so in terms of support for accountability, exercises, et cetera, that all remains very strong. But this is the result of an investigation that we've done, and now we can say publicly that that determination is consistent with what we're seeing.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. I notice, in some of these cases where you do a determination, there's also, genocide is something that you can determine. Can you talk about whether you have sort of ran these facts up against the test for genocide? Have you decided that this doesn't represent genocide, or is that still something that could happen? And specifically, you mentioned the deportation of children, which the Yale researchers, mentioned could be used as evidence in a genocide case. So, given that report is in hand, does that add to your response to the first question?
Yeah, thank you. So nothing about this determination would preclude a subsequent finding that genocide is being committed by some parties involved with the Russian invasion. That's still the subject of further determination. The difference between genocide and crimes against humanity is one of intent. It must be shown that the perpetrators are acting with the intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. And so that really involves getting into the head of particular perpetrators, which can be difficult to do with open source investigations. Now, your point about the recent Conflict Observatory report is a very good one. This is a State Department funded initiative, although the Conflict Observatory is entirely independent, based at Yale University. Their most recent report focused on the deportation of children and the determination that they could corroborate at least 6,000 children in a number of different sites across Russia-controlled territory that have been deported now or have been trapped within Russia and may be subjected to sham and forcible adoptions. Their investigation is based entirely on open source research in this regard, but the abduction of children is one of the indicia of genocide. It's one of the ways in which genocide can be committed. We often think about genocide as being the equivalent of mass killing, but the treaty itself actually defines other forms of genocide. So we will continue to be alive to other indicia that genocide may be happening going forward.
Thank you for doing this. I'm wondering if you've already shared all of this evidence that you guys collected to make this determination with international bodies, and if you haven't done so yet, when you plan to, and how quickly you think prosecutions could come. I know that's probably a hard estimate to make, but is it possible that we see prosecutions while this conflict is ongoing?
So there generally are three now active pathways to justice. One is the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, which is actively pursuing cases. Their courts are open and operative, and they've brought a number of cases already. The State Department is supporting the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, which is deploying experts drawn from the world's war crimes tribunals to Kyiv to support their counterparts in that effort. The second pathway to justice is, of course, the International Criminal Court, seized of jurisdiction by virtue of Ukraine's consent to jurisdiction. And then finally, you have a number of European law enforcement offices joining together to form a joint investigative team. They're sharing information about potential cases with an eye towards bringing cases in European courts. And there are a number of investigations that are happening around the world as well. Our own Department of Justice has created the War Crimes Accountability Team, the so-called WarCat. They're focused on this new legislation that Congress has given us. So there are a number of different pathways whereby information can be shared in order to support accountability.
Have you already shared the evidence that you guys collected for this determination
with
all three of those?
We don't tend to discuss exactly what information gets shared, but know that we are trying to support accountability wherever it is being pursued.
And then just to clarify, so additional prosecutions could come obviously before the conflict is over, given what you've just described there as the
This
ongoing
is the
process.
assumption. I mean, besides the cases happening in Ukrainian courts, we know that the ICC is fully seized of this, and then this joint investigative team as well. The challenge will be, of course, getting custody of accused. And while individuals remain within Russia, they will probably enjoy impunity because there is no international police force who can go and make those arrests.
Sure.
Camilla, I got help.
Hi, thank you, Ambassador. Just going back to your answer to Simon, you mentioned that with a genocide determination, you need to prove intent, but that obviously that's difficult with open sourcing and without getting into the heads of the perpetrators. Is there a way or a method in which you can start to gather that evidence in terms of getting into someone's head? Is that by getting hands on Russian documentation, or other ways in which to do that?
Indeed, courts in the past have been able to infer intent even without a sort of admission by a particular perpetrator. And there's a number of different factors that have been looked at, including, for example, the gratuitousness of violence. So some of the sexual violence that we've seen that serves absolutely no potential military objective whatsoever, attacking civilians while they're in flight, serves no military purpose that can possibly be conceptualized. So that's one set of facts that could lead towards a finding. Second, of course, is the de-Ukrainization rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin, the idea that Ukraine doesn't exist as a sovereign entity or even as a concept, that the Ukrainian people don't exist. So those are the types of things that one would be looking at, I think, in order to determine whether or not.
And in the context of children being taken?
And then the children being taken as well as a sort of third indicia.
Would that be looking at Russian documentation of
Yes,
activities
so
taking
there's a
children?
whole range of sources, including insiders who can reveal the thought processes of those in positions of power, seized documents that might be leaked. We know there have been a number of leaks that the Ukrainians have received, and so these could all be potential sources.
Alex?
Thanks so much for coming down here and making us a little bit more smarter on this topic. I've never heard of any country being designated as, determined as committing crimes against humanity before. Correct me if I'm wrong, do you have a list of countries or entities have been determined? And my second question, you mentioned 3 avenues in your response to my colleague's question. When it comes to holding Russian leaders, Putin in particular, accountable, is there any particular avenue, one of these 3, that you are focused on mostly? Thanks so much.
I'll take your second question first. No, not particularly. I think any court that's open and able to do so would be, I think, welcome. So it remains to be seen whether custody can be achieved over Putin. But there's a whole range of other individuals below Putin who are responsible for not only planning but also ultimately executing this campaign of violence against the Ukrainian civilian population. And so many prosecutors will take a pyramidal approach. Will they start with more low-level individuals, glean what information they can from them in order to build cases up the chain of command. And so I imagine that's what prosecutors around the world are thinking about right now. To your first question, we have done such determinations in the past. So for example, when it comes to violence against Yazidis, that was determined to be crimes against humanity and genocide, and many other ethnic and religious minorities were also subject to attack by ISIL in Syria and Iraq. We've also looked at the Rohingya matter and described that as both genocide and crimes against humanity as well. Almost a year ago today, the Secretary Blinken went to the U.S. Holocaust Museum and announced that particular determination with respect to the Rohingya genocide. So we have done it in the past. It's essentially a policy tool that we use in order to call attention to the egregiousness of particular violations happening within either a conflict or a persecution situation.
Thank you, Ned. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Just to clarify, neither Ukraine nor the U.S. are signatories to the Rome Protocol, for instance. So where would they take it to? That's one. And second, I have a question on the Palestinian territories. I mean, much of what you have described occurs day in and day out in the Palestinian occupied territories. The Israelis do this day in and day out, including today. They killed 10 people and injured 100 others. Many of them, lots of them are civilians. So, there's home demolitions and so on. But you discourage the Palestinians from pursuing, of course, that you are recommending for Ukraine. And my question to you is why not? I mean, since we see events like summary execution, home demolition, forced defection, and so on.
Yeah, so with respect to the Palestinian authorities, the question arises as to whether or not it's sufficiently a state in order to invoke ICC
but
jurisdiction.
not the Palestinian Authority. We're talking about an occupied territory. There's a military occupation force that really controls these territories.
But only states can invoke the ICC jurisdiction. And I think that's the open question that would have to ultimately be litigated by the court itself. When it comes to Ukraine, states can voluntarily submit themselves to jurisdiction, and that's what Ukraine has done, although it has not ratified the statute, as you note, nor has the United States. And we've always said that it's a sovereign decision of any state to decide whether or not to ratify a treaty and to join the ICC, and we have no objection to states doing that, or to exercising their right to consent on an ad hoc basis to jurisdiction, which is what Ukraine has done.
Final question, Jane?
Yes, something different. Do you think North Korean leader Kim Jong-un should be referred to the ICC?
Well, there was an effort, if I'm remembering correctly, back in 2014 to consider whether or not the Security Council would refer the matter of North Korea to the ICC. And as I recall, that effort was blocked by some permanent members of the Security Council. So absent North Korea referring itself, which of course would not happen, the only way to assert jurisdiction would really be through the Security Council.
If you could indulge one final question.
Sure. Yeah.
In your statement, you mentioned Russian forces and Russian officials. Are their names compiled to be prosecuted, or are we talking about the entire chain of command?
Yes, thank you. A number of names have been identified, including through the Conflict Observatory, which was mentioned. Many of these individuals are already subject to a sanctions determination, including Maria Lvova-Belova, the so-called Child's Rights Commissioner, which really has to be in air quotes. These individuals are already subject to sanction, but they are also potentially subject to criminal prosecution.
I'm really going to press my luck, but Ian, final question.
I was just wondering if you could give any thoughts on how the pursuit of criminal justice in this might play into the eventual diplomatic negotiations that people hope will bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, in some cases in the past with the ICC, there's been some thought that and debate about the fact that if you pursue certain people who are still in power, they may not step down, or they may encourage them to keep going. So I'm just wondering if any of that, if you have any thoughts on that debate in this particular situation.
Indeed, it is a perennial debate, and we've seen in previous situations where individuals who have been subjected to accountability processes have been able to be excluded from peace arrangements such that peace can prevail with respect to more moderate leaders. And so I think that would be the thinking here, is that there would have to be individuals who will be willing to commit to a pathway of negotiations and diplomacy in order to instantiate any kind of realistic or just peace. There have been plenty of openings now for President Putin to do that, and he has always rebuffed those openings. We're now having a special session at the General Assembly this week with the goal of bringing the world together to encourage the instantiation of a real and genuine peace, one that is fair to the sovereignty of Ukraine, and so it remains to be seen whether Russia will take that opening.
Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Always
Thanks, everyone.
value having Ambassador Van Schok here. I offered her the opportunity to stay and do the whole briefing, but she declined. So before we turn to your questions, let me go through a couple items at the top. First, the United States is extremely concerned by the levels of violence in Israel and the West Bank. Today in Annapolis, at least 10 Palestinians, including both militants and civilian bystanders, were killed and over 100 injured during an Israel Defense Forces counterterrorism operation. We wish a speedy recovery to those injured, and our hearts go out to the families of the innocent bystanders who were killed today. We recognize the very real security concerns facing Israel. At the same time, we are deeply concerned by the large number of injuries and the loss of civilian lives. We had productive conversations in recent days with the parties and U.S. regional partners in support of efforts to prevent further violence. We are deeply concerned that the impact of today's raid could set back efforts aimed at restoring calm for both Israelis and Palestinians. Today's events further underscore the urgent need for both sides to work together to improve the security situation in the West Bank. We also call on all parties to desist from actions that inflame tensions, such as incitement to violence, evictions of families from their homes, demolitions, settlement advancements, and the legalization of outposts. Israelis and Palestinians, as we have consistently said, equally deserve to live in safety and security. Next and finally, as you know, Secretary Blinken returned last night from his trip to Germany, Turkey, and Greece, where he continued our close coordination with allies and partners on the critical security issues facing Europe and the rest of the world. The United States, our allies and partners, remain united with Ukraine, and we are resolved to hold Russia accountable for its crimes against humanity and other atrocities and abuses. While visiting areas affected by the earthquakes, the Secretary expressed the United States' full support for the people of Turkey and Syria as they recover from these devastating earthquakes. At the Munich Security Conference, Secretary Blinken met with leaders from around the world, including those from Armenia, Azerbaijan, France, Germany, Iraq, Israel, Japan, Moldova, the Palestinian Authority, the People's Republic of China, the Republic of Korea, Serbia, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and Yemen. During all of these meetings, the Secretary reaffirmed our commitment to uphold the principles of the UN Charter, such as respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, which undergird the rules-based international order. The Secretary then visited Turkey immediately following the Munich Security Conference to express profound condolences from the American people for the loss of life following the recent devastating earthquakes. While visiting the areas hit by earthquakes in the Hatay region with Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu, he witnessed firsthand the tragic devastation and announced an additional $100 million in humanitarian assistance, bringing the total U.S. government response to the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria to $185 million in life-saving aid. While on the ground in Adana, the Secretary met with first responders, including the USAID search and rescue teams and the Syria Civil Defense, also known as the White Helmets. While the devastation from these natural disasters is heartbreakingly profound, he was inspired by the dedication of first responders, brave, extraordinary citizens, humanitarian workers, and so many others in the international community who are helping the people of Turkey and Syria in their time of great need. Together, as friends and allies, we will overcome this tragedy, and the Secretary reiterated that message. Secretary Blinken also met with President Erdogan to affirm the United States' ongoing commitment to providing necessary assistance for our NATO ally Turkey to recover and to rebuild. The meeting underscored Turkey's vital contributions as an ally and strategic partner in support of Euro-Atlantic security. During the Secretary's visit to Greece, he highlighted how the United States and Greece are advancing our shared goals for peace and prosperity in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Western Balkans, the Black Sea region, and beyond. He also thanked Greece for its support of Ukraine. He met with Prime Minister Mitsotakis to affirm the United States' strong partnership with Greece and to reaffirm U.S. support for Greece's essential contributions to the alliance and its continued leadership in the region. During the opening of the reinforcing NATO's eastern flank in response to Russia's brutal war in Ukraine. The Secretary also highlighted Greece's role in strengthening regional energy security and the growth in people-to-people ties between our countries. He emphasized the positive impact the increased U.S.-Greek cultural and educational cooperation will have on our relationship for generations to come. He also met with the Foreign Minister Dendidis, to discuss their recent trips to Turkey and the urgent assistance required to rebuild from the devastating earthquakes. So it was quite a busy trip. It was a very full itinerary, and now we are looking forward to going to New York tomorrow. So no rest for the weary. So with that,
Right.
Matt.
Thank you, Ned. Let's start with your opening and on Nablus in Israel. So by my count, you have like one extremely concerned and two deeply concerned, at least in your rhetoric. Now, when the settlement expansion was announced 10 days ago or so, you were deeply troubled. So is there any difference between deeply concerned and deeply troubled or extremely concerned?
Matt,
Does it mean anything in terms of what you're actually going to do in response, which doesn't seem to be a whole lot?
It means precisely what I just said. We are deeply concerned. We are deeply troubled by events in recent days. I wouldn't try and parse these words too closely, but I think the level of our concern, the level of our dismay should be clear in precisely what we've said. We have consistently, not just during this phase of heightened tensions, but consistently over the course of this administration, urged both Israelis and Palestinians to avoid steps that only inflame, that only exacerbate underlying tensions. It's especially critical that now, in the midst of a period that has seen far too many lives lost to violence on both sides, Palestinian lives, Israeli lives, it is especially important during this period that both sides, Israelis, Palestinians, not take steps that only serve to inflame tensions and that actually take steps to de-escalate tensions. We were encouraged to see the arrangement that Israelis and Palestinians had come to over the weekend. We think that type of coordination, that type of arrangement could indeed serve to help de-escalate tensions. We are ready as a partner to Israel as a partner to Palestinians, as a partner to the other countries in the region with whom we've also been working closely, to do everything we can to support the parties in the steps that they themselves must take to de-escalate tensions. Now is especially important for them to do so.
So the arrangement that you just mentioned, that you said hoped could lead to the de-escalation, well, I mean, it clearly didn't work, at least in the short term, 2 days ago. Hasn't worked so far. Are you ready to say that that was a failure?
Well, first of all, this is an arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians.
I didn't say it wasn't. I'm just
no,
saying
but
you said it was a.
My point.
Encouraged by it, and you can't be encouraged now because it didn't seem to do anything.
Well, Matt, you also alluded to the fact that you're talking over the time horizon of a couple days. We are not ready to render a verdict. It is certainly our hope that the type of arrangement that Israelis and Palestinians had worked out in recent days does indeed, in the coming days, serve to de-escalate tensions. That is what we think is most important. We were a partner to both Israelis and Palestinians in their efforts in recent days to find an arrangement such as this. Other countries in the region played a very constructive and useful role as well. We are prepared to continue to be a partner to both, to support the steps, but ultimately to support the steps that Israelis and Palestinians themselves must undertake. These are not steps that the United States can take. These are not steps that other countries in the region can take, but we are prepared to be a partner as Israel and the Palestinian Authority. We hope take steps that do in fact de-escalate tensions.
Okay, last one. Part of that arrangement was that neither side was going to take, or at least the Israeli, on the Israeli side of the arrangement, was they weren't going to announce any new settlement expansion or outpost legalization for the next, I think they said several or few months, but other people's understanding was that it was for 6 months. But anyway, it very much looks like they're going to go ahead and announce new settlement activity and outpost legalization, if they haven't done so already, tomorrow. But apparently, according to people who were there in the room where it was approved today. Is that a violation of this agreement and your efforts to try and prevent the Palestinian proposed resolution from coming to a vote and replacing it with a presidential statement, a weaker document, seem to have not produced the result that you wanted, at least in terms of how it relates to the situation on the ground. It might have prevented a big debate during this week, Ukraine week, at the UN, but it doesn't seem to have helped the situation on the ground. Is that an accurate assessment?
A couple things, Matt. First, on the arrangement between Israelis and Palestinians, again, this is not something that we are a party to. We're going to leave it to the parties themselves to speak to the details of the arrangement that they had reached. Now, you may be alluding to reports that are out today of potential settlement expansion. Our understanding, and again, this is our understanding, we would ultimately have to refer you to the parties in question to speak to the underlying facts, but our understanding is that this is not a new settlement announcement or expansion. More broadly, we have made our view clear. We have made it clear in national statements, including the one from Secretary Blinken over a week ago, in multilateral statements, including the statement from our Quint partners, our allies and partners in Europe, and in the statement that emanated from the UN Security Council a couple days ago. We view the expansion of settlements as an obstacle to peace that undermines the geographic viability of a two-state solution. The expansion of settlements, legalization of outposts, demolitions, incitement to violence, these are all among the steps that would be unilateral in nature and that would only serve to exacerbate tensions, and that we have urged both parties not to take. Anything else on this? Yeah. Sure, Saeed.
If I may, just to follow where you started at the top. Now, this has been probably one of the bloodiest weeks and months in the last 20 years, at least since 2002. And it seems that every time, there is some sort of political crisis in Israeli governance, that is like a pattern or a roadmap that they follow. And so we see it time and time again. They're exporting the whatever political crisis they might have and take it out on the Palestinian. And I'm afraid, that sure, you expressed these things and it was a very clear statement that you made, but it seems, unfortunately, that the Israelis they don't care. They just go on. They dismiss any other effort that might take place at the UN, or even the statement that was issued that was really watered down. But in fact, this thing that is going on continue to go on. Can you put some muscle behind your statement that you are concerned? But what will you do if the Israelis continue with this, iron fist against an unarmed population?
So, Saeed, to the first part of your question, we wouldn't, nor could we, speak to specific motivations. We are speaking to the facts as they are communicated to us and as they are communicated to the rest of the world. We are speaking to the implications of the facts on the ground. And unilateral acts, including expansion of settlements, legalization of outposts, those are obstacles to peace. Those are the obstacles to a negotiated two-state solution that over the course of decades now, successive American administrations have endorsed. Israelis and Palestinians themselves have endorsed. We are having conversations with all of the parties. We are having conversations privately with our Israeli partners. We're having private conversations with our Palestinian partners. We're having conversations with our regional partners as well. This is obviously a conversation that is taking place among and between a wider swath of countries. And you saw the UN Security Council issue a statement over the weekend that was entirely consistent with what you have heard from the United States. Our overarching priority is to preserve the viability of a negotiated two-state solution to the conflict. Only with a negotiated two-state solution will the Palestinians be able to achieve their legitimate aspirations for sovereignty, independence, and freedom in a state of their own, living side by side next to a vibrant democracy and a Jewish state. That is critical. The viability of a two-state solution is critical to both parties. It is critical to our approach to this conflict, our broader approach to this region.
In the meantime, just one follow-up. In the meantime, we see this, this Israeli policy of going in and killing innocent Palestinians, go unabated. They feel that they have total impunity in conducting these operations. Today's operation was in broad daylight. It was like 9 or 10 in the morning. So they know full well that there was going to be no opposition for them whatsoever. So they target people who are unarmed. So what should happen? What should happen to at least stem or stop this Israeli violence?
Cite 2 points. First is the point that Israel faces very real threats to its security. We have seen horrific reminders of that, even in recent days. Israel has every right to defend itself against acts of terrorism and violence. In doing so, and this is the second point, we have encouraged Israel repeatedly, as we do countries around the world, to do so in a way that minimizes any potential civilian casualties, any potential civilian harm. The death of a single innocent civilian is a tragedy. This is not a sentiment that is unique to the United States. This is a sentiment that we have heard from countries around the world, including from our Israeli partners. It is imperative that steps be taken to minimize civilian harm, to minimize civilian casualties. The IDF and Israel more broadly has spoken to some of those steps. But again, we urge Israel to exercise caution and to do what it can while it responds to very real threats to its security to minimize the possibility of civilian harm. Roslyn?
Specifically, with whom has the U.S. government engaged Have they spoken to the prime minister? Have they spoken to the foreign minister? Have they spoken to their own security coordinator on the ground? Have they spoken to Palestinian officials who would be in charge of security? How deep are these conversations? And the follow-up, it's one thing to express concern. It's one thing to say that both parties have a right to guarantee their security. It's one thing to express sympathy for those who were caught in the crossfire. But what leverage is this administration exerting on both sides to actually preserve the two-state solution, to not engage in provocative actions, and to not be seen in some quarters as trying to disrupt what the U.S. would like to see, which is the eventual creation of two states side by side, living in peace and security?
A couple of things, Rosalind. To your first question, the short and non-specific answer is yes. We have engaged through multiple channels to our Israeli partners, to the Palestinians as well. We've done so through diplomatic channels, including via our embassy in Jerusalem, through the Palestinian Affairs Unit in Jerusalem as well. We've done so from this building, including at high levels. We've done so through security channels. We have done so through all appropriate avenues. As you know, Secretary Blinken himself was on the phone over the weekend with the Prime Minister Netanyahu, with President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. That, of course, was predated today's violence, but even in the wake of today's violence, we have been in direct contact with the parties themselves via multiple channels to stress upon them the need for the parties themselves, for Israelis and Palestinians themselves, to take steps to de-escalate tensions. This gets to your second question. The United States is a partner. We are a partner to Israel. We are a partner to the Palestinians. Ultimately, our message, and the message that both parties are hearing from countries in the region, is that it is incumbent on them to take steps, not only to avoid steps that only exacerbate tensions or inflame tensions, but to actually take steps to de-escalate tensions. We are, in our capacity as a partner, coordinating between and among them. We are providing ideas. We are putting ideas and proposals on the table in coordination with the parties themselves and countries in the region. We think that is the most constructive role for us to play, knowing that, again, ultimately, the parties themselves are going to need to be responsible for taking steps that ultimately de-escalate these underlying
But
tensions.
there's nothing that the U.S. can say to either Israel or the PA in terms of, if you don't do this, we're going to do that, and that may not turn out well for you. There's no pressure that this administration can bring on either party to de-escalate.
Rosalind, we're going to do what we think is going to be effective. And whether it is in this context, whether it is in other contexts and regions around the world, typically it is less than effective for the United States to make very specific, let alone public, I don't want to call them threats because that's not what we engage in, but the type of thing that you are asking about. We are having conversations, private conversations with both parties. Publicly, we are making very clear where the United States stands. We don't want there to be any ambiguity whatsoever about what we would like to see the parties themselves do, what we would like to see the parties themselves avoid. That is what we can do most effectively from a place like this, from the podium. We can have private conversations to encourage the parties to share ideas, to share proposals, to put ideas on the table. We think that is a constructive role for the United States to play. It's precisely the role the United States has played over the course of the past 2 years. You may recall in the springtime, early summer of 2021, when there was rocket fire and ultimately violence between Israel and Gaza. The United States played a very active role, behind the scenes largely, but a very active role, going from Israelis to Palestinians, vice versa, working with parties in the region. We did that once again last year, where there were heightened tensions and violence. That's precisely what we're doing now.
Thank
Anything
you.
else on this? Go ahead.
let me go a little bit to history. Several U.S. presidents, American presidents, played the heavy-handed when Israel stand on the way and challenge their policy in the Middle East. I name President Carter in Camp David and President Ford during the disengagement talk after the 1973 war. In both times, when the United States threatened to review the relation, Israel followed through. My question is, since it has been happening day and time again, and I think everybody get bored to it, including you, are you considering doing the same thing, or trying to say, hey, guy, we gotta put our relation in review our relation if you don't follow through? Are you considering such a step?
This is really another way of asking the question I just answered of Rosalind, and it goes back to what I just told her. We are a partner to Israel. We have a long-standing relationship with Israel. We are a partner to the Palestinian Authority and to the Palestinian people. You call it our policy. It is certainly a United States policy that a negotiated two-state solution is the only way to address and to resolve this conflict over the longer term, but it is not a policy that is ours alone. This is an in-state that Israelis and Palestinians themselves, countries in the region as well, have long embraced and endorsed as the only viable solution to what has been a long-standing conflict. We are going to do what we think is effective to help, again, because we are not, it is incumbent on the parties themselves to actually take these steps, but to help support the parties. As in the first instance, we encourage them not to take steps that exacerbate tensions, and from there, to take steps that seek to lower tensions, to de-escalate tensions in what is a period that has seen tensions only become more heightened. We're having discussions with both parties. We're having discussions with countries in the region to attempt to devise and share ways we can do that. That is a model, it's an approach that has proved effective over the course of this administration. We are working day in and day out to do what we can, recognizing again that the parties themselves are going to have to take these steps, but doing what we can to support the parties in taking these steps. I need to move around. Anything else on this before we move on? Okay, Janie?
Thank you. I have two questions. Thank you, Nate. First question is North Korea. North Korea fired the Hwasong-15 ballistic missile, and